Hey everybody, I wanted to do something a little bit different today. This will be the first time I've ever reviewed a master game and for my YouTube channel. I sort of picked this game at random. I wanted to start with one of the old masters because I feel like, in sort of a selfish way, like the most useful thing for me in reviewing master games would probably be to start with some of the older masters and sort of work my way forward in time so that hopefully, the knowledge of the old players is the foundation, and then we can build on that as we, catch up to the modern day. Obviously, even though these players were playing 150 years ago, they were tremendously talented and playing at a much higher level than I have ever dreamed of playing at, but there's still much to learn here. So anyway, I picked this game between Morphy and Anderssen. This was a game that was played in 1858 in Paris as part of Morphy's European tour, where he was beating all the great European players. In reading about this match, it seems like some people consider this to be sort of a de facto world championship, since Anderssen was considered one of the best players of the time. And, obviously Morphy was also very highly regarded, but, since the early part of his career, he was in the United States and hadn't played a lot of the European greats. These were sort of the years where Morphy was really proving himself and, sort of became the obvious world number one. So in any case, this is actually the final game of their match. It was an 11-game match that Morphy ended up winning 7-2 with 2 draws. Another interesting thing that I read about this match, and this is like typical 1850s kind of stuff, but apparently Morphy was really ill leading up to the match with intestinal influenza, and the medical practice at the time was to treat this with leeches. So Morphy was quite low on blood to the point that he couldn't even stand without assistance, but he insisted on continuing with the match that he had scheduled with Anderssen. I think Anderssen was visiting France and wouldn't be there for long, so there was this limited opportunity that they had to compete. So yeah, even though Morphy was low on blood and pretty seriously ill, he actually handled Anderssen pretty easily. So anyway, Morphy is white in this game. So let's go ahead and get started. Morphy opens. Let's see if I can get this to work. Morphy opens with e4. Anderssen replies with e6, looking like a French defense. Morphy gets this pawn duo in the center, and then Anderssen plays a really strange move that I'd certainly never seen before and had no idea what to make of it. G6. So when I saw this move, my question was, well, is this some old-timey theory that I'm not privy to? And it seems like it probably was strange even back then. I don't know, but in my database, this position had occurred 230,000 times, and this move was played only 121 times. So quite a rare variation. It doesn't have a name that I could find. So, I'm not an opening theoretician, so it was sort of difficult for me to try to understand what's going on here. But some of my thoughts when I see this, black has a lot of weaknesses on the king side, dark squares over here. So it seems like this bishop is going to be, an extremely important piece to sort of protect all of these squares. Presumably the king's going to end up over here. So a very important piece. The other thing that occurred to me as well, in a normal French defense, you're pushing d5 right away, you're challenging this pawn duo. So by neglecting this, you're sort of allowing white to have really good central control very early on. And that's something that Morphy, I think, took advantage of in this game. And the other thing that I thought of, and I really don't know if this is like anything, but, I wondered if maybe like f5 is one day something that black is like hinting at. Like, if you really want to establish a pawn on f5 that's going to be well supported, I mean, I guess you've got it with these moves, but it still strikes me as a really strange move, and we'll see how Morphy takes advantage of it. So Morphy also played what I thought was kind of a strange move next. He played bishop d3. This diagonal doesn't seem like the most important diagonal to me. I didn't really know what the most important diagonal for the light squared bishop would be. It's not really clear at this point how the pawn structure is going to shake out and what's going to be open, what's going to be closed. So my interpretation is that, the reason that Morphy's making this move now rather than, developing the queen knight, something a little more natural, is it looks to me like he wants to play knight e2 and get the bishop out of the way and be able to castle. My understanding is Morphy plays this kind of setup against the French, with bishops here and maybe knights here and here sometimes. So an interesting setup, definitely not something you see, in the modern game. Anderssen continues by just fianchettoing the bishop. As I alluded to, these weak squares need protecting, so that makes sense. He's also attacking the pawn right away. So Morphy addresses that by deploying the other bishop behind a pawn. And Black, immediately starts to try to put pressure on this pawn. So, he's ready to trade a flank pawn for a central pawn, which is, generally advantageous for the side getting rid of the flank pawn. I mentioned this big pawn center that White has. It makes sense for Black to try to chip away at it. But Morphy likes his pawn duo, so he plays c3. He's going to maintain the big center. And Black follows through and just takes on d4. I thought this was a little strange also because, when I see this kind of structure for White, my thought is, well, I don't want to take this pawn and allow this pawn to come to the center and grant this square for the knight. So I'm not really sure, what the purpose of that move was, what was achieved for Black, but you are removing a defender of d4, so and Black does immediately, apply some more pressure to the pawn, so maybe that's the purpose of taking. And Morphy does play knight e2, so now the bishop d3 move sort of makes sense, and Morphy's ready to castle. Black deploys the other knight to e7, not the normal f6 square, but this makes total sense, right? The bishop wants to be able to see the world, put pressure on this pawn, and if the knight just deployed to the normal f6 square, then you might be running into e5. So it makes sense to go to e7, I think. And then both players castled. And now Morphy develops the other knight to c3. And at this point, I sort of stopped and looked at the position, because, White's got all of his minor pieces developed. He's, pretty much ready to go. Every piece is looking pretty happy. The queen can be developed next. The rooks are connected. Everything looks good. If you look at Black's position, though, you can't really say the same. This bishop can't develop at the moment. As long as the bishop can't develop, this rook can't come to the c8 square where it wants to be. So, Black is struggling to deploy the queen side a bit here. And, I think that's really White's main advantage right now is he's developed well and he's sort of ready to start attacking. And Black's still got to kind of figure out where some pieces are going to go. All that being said, Black's next move makes total sense in view of that, d5. So you're giving a bishop the square. You're finally, hitting at this pawn duo. White's already been able to maneuver behind his big center quite a bit. So it seems like it's time to maybe break that up. Morphy wants to keep the center closed. And, it's kind of nice. These bishops right behind the closed center actually do control some squares, whereas Black's bishop is not really doing so much. So it makes sense. And also, if Morphy had taken on d5 and black recaptures with the e6 pawn, then suddenly this bishop has a lot more scope. So I think really the main purpose of this is, again, for to make it so that black's development is not natural, so that it's slow and difficult to achieve. So black understands this. I think black wants to sort of break out and not be so cramped anymore, so he plays f6. But Morphy's not going to let that happen. Morphy just plays f4, and then we have a trade on e5. So okay, at least black's got a rook on an open line here, but the problems with the queen side are definitely still present. So, and now black plays another kind of slow move, a6. I think the purpose of this is that this square looks pretty juicy for the knight, and I think that's something that black really can't allow. So a6 makes sense. But again, black's having to play slow, and white's pieces are looking good and ready to go, even though this knight, just had a possible destination taken away. At least he's still out and playing. This bishop not playing, the rook's not playing. So now Morphy develops the queen d2, creating this nice battery, and connecting the rooks, which is obviously something important to do in developing. When I see this, I always think about, okay, well, I talked about how important this bishop is, and white's dark squared bishop looks like the quote-unquote bad bishop because it's behind all of these central pawns that are fixed. So, maybe this is the idea, is just to play bishop h6 and trade off these bishops. But actually, Morphy has a different idea in mind here. Knight b4. At this point, I kind of question, okay, well, has Morphy done something wrong? Because this is his good bishop, and it's under attack. Black's ready to trade the knight for it, and it really doesn't have any good moves, right? I mean, the only way to avoid this exchange is to play bishop b1, which obviously you don't really want to do, because then your rook is completely useless. But in fact, this doesn't really seem to slow Morphy down at all. He continues with his plan, bishop g5. So I think, this sort of reveals the purpose of queen d2, not to play bishop h6, but to be able to play bishop g5 without fear of black playing h6 and shooing the bishop away. So, the bishop's quite nice here, pinning the knight, again, creating problems for black to try to solve in order to, fully deploy his pieces. Okay, but, this good bishop is still under attack, so black follows through and trades it off. And I did question here, well, the queen has been drawn away, so if h6 was a good idea, can we just play it now and try to get rid of the bishop? But no, this position is quite bad. After we trade, I think the computer suggests that black trades some rooks or whatever, but in any case, the g6 pawn hangs, and you can see this black king is looking a little suspicious out on his own with, only the h6 pawn around. And I think the computer says something like +6 or 4.5, something like that. Some big number. So back to real life. Instead, Anderssen finally tries to develop the queen bishop. I mean, again, this is the only square it can really go to. And the rook is ready to come to c8. Morphy plays queen h3. This is another one that I really never would have considered. I thought there might have been an idea of pushing the h pawn in order to try to soften up this point. h4, h5 combined with knight g3. But now the h pawn's blocked, so it looks like that's not going to happen. Again, h6 is prevented. If there was ever an idea It's not going to happen. Maybe bishop h6 is back on the table in some lines. And, I mean, in general, this queen is just sort of menacing to the black king side. It wasn't really clear to me yet, how the queen is going to get in there, how this attack is going to unfold. But, Morphy gets there pretty quickly. And also, again, I've talked a lot about making it so that black can't develop. Well, this bishop is, in my eyes, half developed. He's off the home row, but he's really not doing anything. He would like to maybe come out to one of these squares, try to do something in the game. But he's stuck behind this pawn, and now he's got the responsibility of watching over the pawn. You certainly don't want to let the pawn fall with check, giving white a passed pawn. So, another good instance of Morphy just keeping the pressure on black and making it awkward for black to make moves. So black tries to untangle. He's getting out of this pin. That's probably the main point. But also he's ready to defend the e6 pawn. So this knight can move. F5 looks like a tempting square. And okay, maybe the knight comes here. And, the bishop can move and not have to worry about defending e6. Knight g3. So this is another move where, I thought this made sense in conjunction with the h4, h5 plan. But now it doesn't seem so clear to me, right? There's no good forward moves for the knight. The knight is not supporting any pawn breaks. And it's sort of boxing the queen in. So it was sort of a mysterious move to me. I thought maybe the idea was to try to route the knight into these weak squares. But that actually does not happen in the game. And we'll soon see how Morphy plans to use this. Okay, so the rook comes to c8. The rook is developing. He's finally getting to an open file, but there's a lot of attacking going on over here, and I wondered if maybe this was a little bit negligent on black's part. I'm not sure what to suggest for black over here. White has great control over a lot of these squares, and it's difficult to develop, but not sure that this rook is really helping much. So Morphy decides to trade the rooks, and basically stealing a tempo here, because after the queen recaptures, the other rook comes to f1 with a tempo on the queen, and the queen returns. So Morphy basically just got to improve his position for free. Now, Morphy's well known for wanting all of his pieces to be doing something. Well, the rook on a1 wasn't doing anything, and now it's effectively traded itself for black's rook on f8. Queen h4. Again, this was a move that wasn't on my radar really at all, but this knight is under fire. But it does seem to encourage the knight to come to an ideal looking square on f5, which is what happens. And Morphy immediately trades it off. I did wonder, going back to this rook exchange, why now exchange the rooks? And, I wondered if there was an idea of, if Morphy sees this position and realizes that knight f5 is coming, maybe he wants to sack an exchange. He's well known for that too. But he doesn't sack the exchange here. He just trades the knights. I ran the position after an exchange sack, and the computer says it's equal, which is, I think, a testament to how good White's position is, that he can give an exchange and still be equal. But in the real world, Morphy just trades the knights, and he's drawing a pawn away from the defense of the king, so he's definitely still getting something from this. And it's worth noting that, whatever black does here, he's giving white one advantage or the other. You're either weakening your king, or you're giving white rather, this passed pawn that will be a great asset in any endgame. But black decides to take with the G pawn, take towards the center. And now rook f4, or f3 rather. Now the attack looks pretty straightforward for white. We're just going to swing the rook, if I can draw this correctly, up and over. We're going to attack down the H file, and black's pieces are all over here. So things are already looking very promising for white. Again, Anderssen makes this sort of move that doesn't really seem to defend the king side much, but it's difficult to suggest much else for black. At least the bishop is finally trying to contribute, although still, what is the bishop doing here? It looks nice, but it is controlling this nice f1 square, but how are black's heavy pieces going to get into f1 to make use of that? Morphy continues with rook g3. I had expected rook h3 because I want to play caveman chess and just, go after this h-pawn. But Morphy wants to really pin down this bishop, which proves to be much more important. Oh, and I forgot to mention this about the bishop move. But, clearing the bishop off the second rank does allow black's rook to come over and defend, which, at least that's something useful. But it's sort of sad that the bishop's only role in the game is to get out of the way of the other pieces. Okay, so rook c7, defending, bishop f6 anyway, pinning down the bishop, and really putting black under a lot of pressure. Yeah, and this move just seems really desperate to me. To this point in the game, Morphy's advantage has really been positional. He's had better active pieces. He's had more pressure on the king. But he hasn't had a tangible material advantage until now. And, the idea is we're going to distract the queen, and we're going to pin this bishop somehow and try to just pose white some problems of how to convert this attack. But this is sort of, I think, a moment where Morphy almost switches gears, and he's thinking less about attack, and then he's thinking more about, now I have a material advantage. How do I cash this in? So Morphy does take the pawn, and Anderssen pins with queen f8. But I don't think Morphy was too perturbed about this. He just plays, he takes out the bishop, which I thought was a bit of a surprising move, because it's easy to really get caught up in the king side attack and let's checkmate this king. And, this bishop isn't really hurting anybody. This rook is suddenly given an open file. So what's the purpose of this? But we'll see very shortly. And I think this was actually, a really great move by Morphy. Now the queen comes into h6, and all of black's pieces are tied down. The bishop can't move. The queen and the rook are tied to the defense, and there's really just nothing black can do. He just plays king h8, which is a really sad move to play. But again, what else do you do? You're sort of just waiting for white to convert this. And again, Morphy played a move which surprises me, but I think shows some really nice understanding here. He takes with the rook first. Rook recaptures, and then if you're the kind of person who likes to guess the move, I think this is a really cool move to guess. So I'll wait a few seconds, and if you want to pause the video and think about what you would play here as white, I think this is a really instructive moment. So if you were looking for a big attacking move and how to checkmate black, that's actually not Morphy's idea here. He just plays the very calm and very cool king f2, which may not seem to have anything to do with anything, but Morphy's idea is, let's just trade all these pieces and go into an endgame. He's got the pawn plus, since black played f4 a few moves ago, Black's queenside pawn structure is not going to be able to do anything in an endgame. So he's just taking one moment to improve the king before going into this endgame, where he'll be able to win, with his 2-1 majority over here. Black unpins the rook, so now there's some threats that Black could actually untangle and do some things. So time to trade everything off, and the king comes to f3. So the king f2 move, it really steals a tempo for white. If you look at this position, if we just play the more normal looking, at least to my eyes, bishop captures, then the rook captures, and we just liquidate everything in the same way, you can see that white's king is one square further back than what happens in the actual game. So it's not a flashy move, but taking with the rook first and then playing king f2, just while you have a nice calm moment before returning to the captures, really makes a difference in these endgames. Now I think the endgame's winning for white regardless, but this is just really nice technique to steal a tempo here. So yeah, again, we've got a 2-1 advantage over here. These pawns can't really cause any trouble on the queen side, and white's king is just closer to the action. So this endgame is just going to be a win for white. Anderssen does play out a few more moves, but I don't think there's really too much to note here. I think he's just playing it out for the sake of it. But after a3, Black finally resigned, and I guess Paul Morphy was the de facto world champion. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty cool game. I really liked how, in the early game, a lot of Morphy's play was just centered around trying to slow down Black, pose him some problems in developing his pieces, while Morphy's able to just develop naturally into nice active squares. So a good example of this is this bishop g5 idea. That's not a square that I'm ever thinking about putting my bishop, because it seems like it can just be rattled. But he sees this, puts the queen on d2 to prevent that, and then the bishop goes to g5. And this kingside attack also really came together quite nicely. Moving the queen here, keeping pressure on e6. These are the kind of moves that I don't really find. And I think, at this point, Morphy knows he wants the queen to come to h4 to put even more pressure on this pinned piece and to create even more of a headache for Black. So this is the way to do it. And yeah, all the pieces are coming in. Steals a tempo there. Yeah, now everything's looking good. And, the attack is just too much. Yeah, and in retrospect, you really have to wonder about this move. I mean, obviously Black's in a lot of trouble, but it seems like f4 really makes things a lot easier for white, because now Morphy doesn't even have to really prove a checkmating attack. He just has to be able to trade down into a winning endgame, which obviously he did with ease. So yeah, a very nice game from Morphy, which I think now we probably take for granted. He's known for such things, but like I said, I think this was the match and the final game that really cemented his place as the greatest player at that time. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this game. I'm going to try to do more of these on YouTube. If you don't know, I do stream on Twitch, playing my own games, not really reviewing master games, but maybe we'll do some of that on Twitch too. So anyway, until next time, take care.